If you're a manufacturing leader, your number one risk over the medium to long term isn't inflation. It isn't the war in Ukraine. It isn't lack of suitable workforce. It isn't foreign competition. You have one number one risk to your business, and that is increasing energy unreliability. That's something you need to understand. You need to understand the drivers. You need to understand what's happening, and you need to understand what you can do about it. Stay tuned, and we'll tell you all about it here on Manufacturing Talks.
Welcome to Manufacturing Talks with Jim Vinosky. Industry has a million cool stories, and Jim talks to the movers and shakers who are making them happen. Let's dive in.
Welcome to Manufacturing Talks. I'm Jim Vinosky, your host. We're sponsored by DYS Media. You'll hear more about them here in a minute. And today I'm really proud to be joined by David Blackmon. He is an energy writer, consultant, and analyst. He's based in Mansfield, Texas. So welcome, David.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thanks for being on. Energy is the topic and how it ties with manufacturing. And as I teed it up on LinkedIn, this is going to be my most important episode ever because it's kind of crunch time on energy, isn't it?
Boy, it really is. It's something. It's amazing how much is going on in the space.
Yeah. And so we've got a bunch of things to cover. What I wanted to hear, first of all, is just, tell us about your background, how you wound up with the energy writing and consulting, but also how you became that minor of absurdities that you have on your LinkedIn.
Yeah, that seems to be my main focus anymore. There's so many absurd things happening in energy. Yeah. I decided to just start doing a daily piece about it, initially on LinkedIn, and then expanded it to a Substack that I maintain now. And my background, I spent 40 years in the oil and gas business. I started as an accountant of all things, and within about 10 years had migrated into public policy work, regulatory and government affairs, and communications towards the end of my career. And when I finally retired out of the oil and gas business in 2016, I went into consulting, and by then had also landed the opportunity to be a contributor at Forbes.com. Writing on energy issues. I've been doing that for 10 years now. And also for a while was the editor and lead writer at Shale Magazine. And now I focus on podcasting, my own podcasts and my Substack work, and as well as continuing to be a contributor at Forbes.
Well, it's all great stuff. And yeah, you're very active and it's much needed. You kind of referred to it about all the stuff that's going on in the energy realm worldwide, but, we're especially concerned with here in the U.S. So just give us the lay of the land. What should people who may not be focused in on this right now, what should they be paying attention to and educating themselves about?
Well, I think the main thing is that we're all going to have decisions to make as we go forward, and how we vote in elections is going to become increasingly important to our energy security as individuals and as a country. One of my favorite sayings is something I got from Daniel Yergin, which is energy security is national security. And if you don't have energy security, as Germany found out the hard way last year, if you don't have energy security, you don't have national security. Germany and much of Europe had allowed themselves to become overly reliant on Russia for their natural gas and oil, and to a lesser extent coal supplies. And Russia invaded Ukraine, and suddenly everyone was pressured to start sanctioning Russia and stop buying fuel from them. And Germany found itself in the midst of a major energy crisis as a result of all that. The same thing's going to happen to the United States eventually if we don't keep our eye on the ball, that we have to continue producing oil and gas and even coal to maintain our national energy security. Wind and solar are not going to be able to replace those fossil fuels, despite the narrative we all see in the media right now. And if we allow policymakers, as the Biden administration is currently trying to do, to diminish our ability to exploit our energy resources here at home, we're going to lose our energy security, and that's going to have a big negative impact on our own national security. So pay attention to that. Pay attention to what these candidates say in their election campaigns about energy. Biden made no secret of his intentions of trying to end oil and gas, and he's following through on that. So none of it should be a surprise. Folks, you really need to pay attention for your own good.
And so what people can't be missing is the obvious driver of all this, which is the climate change hysteria and CO2 levels, and wanting to reverse the tide on the rise of CO2 levels. What's your take on, if you look at the facts and not the hysteria, how do we prioritize between arresting that increase in CO2 if that's necessary and providing for energy security?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because, you know, there is science, and it's real science, that indicates that higher levels of carbon dioxide do tend to cause a, quote, greenhouse effect. Even some Exxon scientists had done some studies years ago that indicated that to be the case. So it is something to watch. But at the end of the day, what we should, my view is, what we should mainly be, or at least primarily focused on, is protecting and maintaining human life. Mm-hmm. And you can't do that without adequate energy production. Our entire food supply, our ability to feed the world, depends on our ability to grow crops and produce enough food to do that. And like it or not, we do that with ammonia-based fertilizers, and the ammonia is created using natural gas. And if we stop producing natural gas, that means we can no longer feed the world. That's a simple reality. Sri Lanka gave us a prime example just 2 years ago. What happens to a country that just says, oh, okay, you can't use ammonia-based fertilizers anymore. You have to go back to using dung and other kinds of organic fertilizers. Well, their whole economy collapsed. Their whole society collapsed. The people got so angry they stormed the palace and forced a change in government. This is, you know, these things, it's easy to talk about doing away with these fertilizers. It's not a practical thing to actually do it. And we have to realize and focus on what's practical, what's most important to protect and preserve human life, and try to balance the desire to cut CO2 with the need to continue producing abundant and affordable energy.
Yeah, one of the things I always push back on with people who say end fossil fuels now is that if you truly want to have that transition, you can't get there without fossil fuels. In fact, you can't get there without increased use of fossil fuels, because we're essentially recreating a lot of our infrastructure and equipment that already exists. And, you know, there's so much out there that's just false and, you know, hyperbolic. Yeah. I want to take kind of in turn some of these different elements of the so-called clean energy transition and have you dive into them. So you mentioned wind and solar. That's obviously a big one where there's a lot of dubious information being put out there. So let's tackle that one. Just give us your thoughts on wind and solar and the facts behind where we stand with that.
Yeah, you know, and so I guess I will preface my comments on that by saying I'm not opposed to wind and solar power at all. I think they're fine sources of electricity generation for use in certain circumstances, and that, you know, to be integrated into a power grid and managed properly. And the key is they have to be managed properly.
Right.
And where we have lost that is when we try to treat wind and solar as if they can be a replacement for what we've always called baseload fuel, which is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year power generated by coal, by natural gas, by nuclear. And when you try to do that, because these are intermittent weather dependent forms of energy, you end up reducing reliability on the grid. And we saw that in Texas 2 years ago with Winter Storm Uri, and 10 years before that with another winter storm that came through before we started giving them names and caused blackouts.
Don't get me started.
Well, we got to name them now because that's how we catastrophize them.
Right.
You name them.
Yes.
But anyway, so ERCOT had anticipated that it was going to be getting 12 gigawatts of capacity from wind and solar on those days during those blackouts. And for a while, they got almost nothing.
Right.
Because they froze up, which is going to happen when the temperature gets to zero and the facilities are not weatherized.
Yep.
And then when a bunch of natural gas froze up as well, we ended up having all those blackouts. You cannot treat these things as if they're base load. You know, people, I know you hear them talk about, well, we're building all these batteries and we're going to back it up.
Right.
Today, in the United States, across the United States, we don't have enough battery backup to keep the lights on in the city of Austin for more than 4 hours. Okay. That's what exists today.
Right.
And if we double, triple that, then we'll be able to keep the lights on for 12 hours in the city of Austin. It's the battery backup that is being built is mainly lithium ion. It's only going to store a few hours of actual electricity for use. But when the lights go out for 4 days, that's not going to do you any good.
Right.
And so we just have to, we have to press our public officials to stop pretending that they can treat wind and solar the same way they have always been able to rely on natural gas and coal and nuclear. They just can't do it. And so what's going to happen if we're ever to really start reducing our use of fossil fuels in any real way is we're going to have a new revolution in nuclear power, because that's the only 24/7 form of zero carbon emission generation that's available, and that's going to be available for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I had storage as one of the topics down here of the crazy
I'm
thing.
sorry.
No, you jumped right to it. It's perfect because you mentioned batteries and yeah, the technology isn't there to have the replacement that we need. And that's clear. And that's one thing that I've been working feverishly to educate people on is where that technology stands and where it even is projected to be 10, 20 years down the road. It's still not going to be there. We hear other forms of storage, pumped hydro and gravity batteries. And can you touch on some of those farther out there things a bit?
I don't know much about those. I do know about some innovative, battery technology that's being developed. But one that I think really has a lot of promise is vanadium. I don't know if you've looked into vanadium.
Nope.
But it's a different kind of battery technology that is being heavily distributed by China. And it's much less weather dependent. Lithium ion batteries tend to discharge very quickly in cold or very warm weather. Vanadium is not impacted by weather. But it's a cutting edge new technology that the United States has not yet begun to adopt, but it's being heavily adopted in China. They're way ahead of us. So there is promising solid state metal batteries, another form of innovative battery that seems to have some promise in this space, but it's going to take years for those things to be developed in a real way in the United States. But even with those, they still don't, you're not going to be able to store an indefinite amount of electricity that's going to be able to power your whole grid for days at a time.
Right.
It's a matter of hours of backup that you're going to have. And so, there's going to have to be a quantum leap in storage technology to make wind and solar in any way a viable alternative to fossil fuels. And, we can't just say, oh, well, we're going to do away with fossil fuels based on a promise of future technological development.
Right.
If you do that, you're committing suicide as a country, and that's way too much of a risk to take.
Right. Yeah, I was just reading this morning about how Germany, which you mentioned, kind of went first on some of this wishful thinking, and now we read a lot about them restarting coal plants and rushing in liquefied natural gas from places all over the globe to bolster what they don't have because they shut all their nuclear or most of their nuclear plants down. But now what we're not really hearing a lot about, I just read an article about this morning, is there's already the beginning of deindustrialization in Germany. And of course, that's my focus here is manufacturing particularly relies on reliable energy 24 hours a day. Most plants' margins can only be met by running around the clock. And so talk a little bit about that. What is it that's driving that in Germany, and what are the implications for us if we continue on the road that we're on right now?
Yeah, and you mentioned it, Germany has had to go onto the international market to obtain LNG, as much LNG as they could to keep the lights on over the winter. And it's very high price natural gas off that international market where they were paying very low prices to have all that Russian natural gas brought in on those pipelines. And so you've quadrupled, quintupled the prices that these manufacturers are heavily dependent on natural gas to power their processes and serve as feedstocks for some of the materials they make. And it's put them out of business. They can't afford to stay in business in Germany when they're having to pay those prices. And so some are just shutting in temporarily and hoping for, things to develop better for them. Some are going out of business entirely, and some have chosen to start moving their businesses to other countries, including China, probably mostly China, because the labor market there is so much cheaper.
Yeah.
And so it's just having really disastrous impacts on Germany's economy. And it's hard to see how they avoid a pretty deep recession as a result of all this.
Well, and they've been so heavily manufacturing focused for decades and decades. It's also difficult to see what the impact on that society is. I was reading just a couple of weeks ago about a BASF plant over there, 4,000 people that's been around for decades, that's scaling back, and people fear is actually going to eventually go away entirely because of this. So yeah, it's crazy times.
And that could happen anywhere. I mean, people need to realize that dynamic could happen in any country.
And we're going
that has a sudden shock and massive increase in energy costs.
Yeah, we're going to drill into that a lot more for the U.S. here when we come back. We're going to take a break right now, hear from our sponsor, DYS Media, and then we'll be back with David Blackmon to continue this essential conversation about energy in the U.S.
DYS Media, your digital media relations agency. Public relations, website design, digital marketing. You get found by the customers and talent who need your solutions. You get media placements in top publications, the best job candidates coming to your website, a digital presence that gets you found by the right people. Call 616-298-8798 to get started today.
Okay, welcome back. Thank you for that note from DYS Media, our sponsor for this episode. And we're back with David Blackmon, writer, analyst, consultant on energy, talking about that critical subject here and what the implications are for manufacturing in the U.S. So one thing I wanted to kind of wrap back around on is you made reference to, you're not entirely opposed to wind and solar, and really more about how we're currently applying it. Can you talk more about where you touched on it can't be base load because of its obvious intermittency. Where does it make sense to apply renewables like that?
Well, I think, with wind, I'm not a fan of wind. Okay. Wind has so many impacts on birds. I've been a bird lover my whole life, and I really
whales now for offshore.
And whales, apparently.
Yeah.
And so I think as wind's impacts on wildlife including endangered species and threatened species like the bald eagle and endangered species like the American right whale. As those become more publicized and people become more aware of them, I think wind's going to have a hard time expanding much further than it already has. It's made some sense to have it out in West Texas, which is just this huge fairway, a very windy area of plains, and up through even the Midwest, through Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, because that's just a fairway for wind in the United States and the North American continent. It makes a lot less sense along the Texas Gulf Coast, where they have been building these big, gigantic wind farms right in migratory areas for all these bird species. Texas has the most diversity of bird species on the planet. And a lot of these birds are just, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, are dying at the hands of these wind turbines that don't need to be there and don't really serve any useful purpose at all on our grid. But the powerful corporations with a good lobby in Austin are managing to have them subsidized and built. So that I'm not a fan of at all. Solar, I really like solar in a lot of ways because it's so versatile. You can put solar panels on any flat area in America, right? They're even developing technology to pave some roads and parking lots with solar tiles. But on top of every Walmart in the country, every big box store, there's just a lot of different ways to deploy solar and deploy it in the demand center for electricity. Whereas wind has to be 100, 200 miles away from the major demand centers, and you have to spend billions of dollars building new transmission lines to move the wind to the markets, as we did in Texas. So solar, I think, has a much more promising future. It also doesn't have these horrible impacts on wildlife that we know of yet. And I really expect to see major expansion of solar power over the next decade, while wind kind of stagnates and maybe even starts to reverse as the turbines, the end of their useful life apparently comes around a lot sooner than the 25 years they advertise. It's more like 10 to 15 years if you're really lucky. Yeah. And I expect really within the next 10 years, we're probably going to see wind's expansion become a retraction, and that'll be a good thing for everybody. But, and again, to the extent that they can develop the battery technology, the storage technology to really store a significant resource of electricity for use when the sun's not shining and the wind isn't blowing, then, they just become increasingly viable. But I just don't think it's wise to necessarily destroy our whole current system on a bet that that's going to happen.
Right. What about, I read about applications where instead of having wind and solar as a grid generation capacity, you have it as the energy that you use to make, say, green hydrogen or ammonia as feedstock for downstream processes. Does that make sense?
Well, some people think it does. It's yet to really be proven on any scalable way. Maybe it will be. Hydrogen seems to have some promise as a transportation fuel, but of course you're going to run in with the problem with hydrogen is you're not going to be able. I've seen people talking about, we'll just decommission these natural gas pipelines and ship hydrogen.
Right.
Well, hydrogen molecules are much tinier than natural gas molecules, okay? And you may have a good solid pipeline for natural gas that doesn't leak, and you start running hydrogen through it, you're going to find hydrogen leaking out of that pipeline where natural gas wouldn't. So that's not really going to be viable. You're going to have an entirely new, incredibly costly transportation system for hydrogen, and you're not going to be able to just repurpose these existing pipelines, and that's really, they can talk, I guess, about moving it on trucks and trains, but we see the hazards with that mode of transportation for hazardous fuels, inflammable fuels, like we've seen in East Palestine, Ohio recently.
Right.
And so hydrogen's a real mixed bag, and they have a lot of issues they have to work out before it can really be viable.
Well, and so speaking of viability, we hear all kinds of different things about another one you mentioned, which is nuclear. And of course,
Yeah.
One of the main arguments people throw it out there is nuclear is just way too expensive. So can you tackle that one a bit more?
Well, yeah, I mean, it is expensive. There's no doubt it's expensive in its current form. And one of the reasons it's expensive is that from the time you make a proposal and start the process of trying to get your permits in place, you're 15 to 20 years before you ever start producing electricity. And a lot of that has to do with the permitting processes in our governments in the Western world. And those processes and the difficulty in obtaining those permits exists mainly because of incidents like 3 Mile Island, like Fukushima, like Chernobyl, that, have been major disasters, not so much 3 Mile Island, but Chernobyl and Fukushima have both been incredible disasters, environmentally and in terms of people's lives. I think nuclear is going to benefit by the new modular technology that's being developed that's much less facility intensive and can be located much closer to population centers. But the real promise is in fusion. And, everybody got excited last December when Livermore Labs announced that breakthrough. But that breakthrough amounted to, what was it, a quarter of a second of a reaction, something like that. Okay. And it's great. It's a wonderful breakthrough, and I'm not downplaying it. It is progress. But you're 20 to 25 years away from fusion. And so that means for 20 to 25 years, you really have to find a way to maintain our current system that we know works and have that last until there's this incredible technological breakthrough that allows us to create nuclear energy with water, basically.
Right.
And you don't have all the radioactivity issues around it.
So going back to where we started, there's a lot of crazy claims out there. If you wanted to just put out 2 or 3 things that people really need to know are completely false and be countering and, working to get out of the public discourse, what would those be?
Well, the first thing I would really work on is the notion that we're going to replace the internal combustion engine with electric vehicles.
Yep.
That's not going to happen, and it's because, my view is, it's mainly because of the resource intensity of those cars and their batteries. People need to understand and should be getting educated on the fact that massive increase in electric vehicle use is going to have several ancillary impacts. Number one, we're going to have to triple the amount of strip mining we do around the world just to supply the minerals needed for the batteries and that go into these automobiles. They're incredibly resource intensive. Second thing is, they're a lot heavier than internal combustion engine cars. And that means you're going to have to upgrade all the roads in the country to prevent them from being destroyed by these 20% heavier cars, suddenly the 20% heavier loads on them. And then the third thing is, Elon Musk said it just 18 months ago. He said, look, we're going to have to double the electricity generating capacity on our grid just to account for the recharging of electric vehicles in the next 10 years. That can't happen. There's not enough resources, money in the world for that to happen. So that's the first thing, is we have to get away from this notion that we're just going to replace all the gas-powered cars out there with electric vehicles. That's not going to happen.
Yep.
Second thing is, I just would repeat, we're not going to be able to replace fossil fuels and nuclear with wind and solar. And the third thing is, we need to focus on more of our resources on on defending and cleaning up our current energy system, which we know works quite well and has worked quite well for a century,
Right.
than on dismantling it and replacing it with something that not only won't work, but can't work. And we just have to start dealing less with these narratives in the media and these kinds of fantasies that are being put out there, and deal with reality. And the reality is we can make progress environmentally. We made a ton of progress environmentally in the last 50 years. So much. I mean, people don't even understand how much cleaner our environment is today than it was 50 years ago. And we can do that while at the same time ensuring that we have the energy we need to maintain our modern way of life. And it's not impossible. The human race has been really good at mitigating for changing climate for time eternal. And there's no reason why we can't do it in this crisis as well.
Right. Yep. One last technology question, and then I have a final one to wrap up with. Carbon capture. What's your take on that?
Well, I think that's going to be, it's going to obviously a big focus area for some of the big oil and gas companies, because the staff expertise needed to be successful at carbon capture is what they already have on staff at an oil and gas company. The same engineering and science types are needed for both applications. It has a lot of promise to really help with the carbon reduction goals. There, particularly along the Texas and Louisiana Gulf Coast, there is such enormous pore space capacity underground and depleted oil reservoirs, salt domes, and other formations underground. I think it has incredible promise and will be a real economic driver for those two states here over the next 20 years. It's really a fit for purpose solution for a lot of this problem. So I'm a big fan.
Well, that's great to hear. And that's another thing we don't talk about enough, is that when you look at the complete mix of solutions out there, we are in a really good spot. It's not the crisis that everyone in the alarmist mode wants to make it out to be. So speaking of that, then, as I said, manufacturers uniquely rely on power, reliable power, 24 hours a day, sometimes 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, almost year round. Plants will run, and they can't be profitable without running that way. So with that in consideration, manufacturing leaders in particular, what should their number one takeaway from this topic be? What should they be talking about?
Communicate with your policymakers. Let them know what your needs are and your concerns are. Because if you don't, the other side communicates with them all the time, and it has the media on its side, and the media communicates with them every night, free commercials for wind and solar. You're not going to get that, so you have to do it face to face in the Capitol. And you have to make sure, both in Washington and your state capital, because in Texas, where I am, our state government has been subsidizing wind for 20 years, and that's mainly what led to the Hurricane Uri event, or the Winter Storm Uri event. So you have to educate these policymakers. They don't know anything about this stuff without you letting them know about it. And that's the truth. And then the second thing is secure your own sites with backup generators. If you have access to natural gas supply, that's great. If you don't, diesel, propane generators, have capacity at your sites to the extent you can afford to do it, that will keep your installations running during severe weather events. Because, the way things are going, the grids are only going to become less and less stable over time, until we have a major crisis that causes a change in political direction.
Right. Excellent advice. Want to thank you, David Blackmon, for being here today. This was, like I said,
thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad to. The most important episode that I've had, and I don't see surpassing it anytime soon, because it truly is critical.
It is, yes.
So yes, follow David on LinkedIn. I do. He has superb commentary every day out there. Sign up for his Substack. He's a fellow Forbes contributor. He and I both contribute there, so follow us both there. And
yes, follow us both. Yes,
definitely educate yourself on this stuff.
Thanks for tuning in to Manufacturing Talks with Jim Vanoski. Watch for new episodes dropping on the first and third Tuesdays of every month.